So I'll give really an introduction to the topic in terms of the challenges we face when frames might be lacking or inappropriate in the context of data collection in international development, and also considering the challenges that the Sustainable Development Goals bring up. So there will be some examples and cases mentioned throughout, but I think then the two colleagues will really bring up the more colorful experiences and case studies afterwards. So the challenges posed by the SDGs really come from this ambition of leaving no one behind. So this means, on the one hand, that we have to ensure coverage of a complete population, including those who might sometimes be hidden or hard to reach and usually neglected. And quite often those populations are also those who are the most vulnerable and might not benefit in terms of development as much as other population groups. So these include, for instance, the homeless or the street children, child-headed households, where it's quite difficult actually to get to interview them. Also, out-of-school children, where we might capture them if we go to the households, but if we go to schools, we might not. Children in private schools, which Matthew is going to talk about more, informal labor, nomads and mobile populations, but also victims of human trafficking or victims of violence, and quite a lot of SDGs and indicators are now targeting those population groups in particular. So there is an interest both in terms of making sure that the entire population is covered in some of the indicators, but also that we're able to capture the specific population groups for some of the indicators that are targeting specifically very vulnerable populations. And then at the same time, it means that we have disaggregation needs, because the SDGs also want countries to not only give us averages, but actually show us what's happening among potentially quite rare populations. So looking at specific age groups, persons with disabilities, migration status, ethnicity and race, which just from asking about it might pose quite different types of problems. Looking at different income groups and also looking at smaller geographical units and employment and occupation status. So, of course, there might be different ways of addressing this. One could have, I think this is the old problem, what is it? One could have other types of data sources. If there is no survey or census data that is available, looking at administrative data or non-traditional data sources. For some of the disaggregations, one could also consider looking at modeling solutions, for instance, small area estimation. But then, well, for some of them also we can think about better measurement approaches in the questionnaire design, such as how to formulate disability questions better. But then I think the topic of this session is really about innovative solutions in the survey and the sampling design. So I had actually some slides here which were about the SDGs, and maybe I have some notes and I'll just talk to those. So the SDGs are capturing indicators in three tiers, and one tier is about indicators that are already, the methodology exists, and there are standards around how to measure those indicators. And globally, if you look at all the countries and what they're able to measure right now and produce, based on an April 2017 estimate, about 50% of the countries are able to actually measure it. And that's about a third of the 232 indicators. Then another third is somewhere in between. So there might be a methodology, but actually most countries are not yet able to provide the data and are not ready to actually produce it. And then another third is the case where we actually don't have a real methodology, we don't know what to do. And of course, a lot of those cases that we are now looking at, where we might not have a frame, fall into that third category. But it also shows that we have two other categories. So this means 50% of the countries have the data. It might mean that actually 50% might not have it right now. So even within the category tier 1 or tier 2, we might still face quite a lot of problems. So Turongo had this quite useful approach to classifying the different challenges that we face in hard-to-survey populations. And the first one is the one I think that is coming out of the title of this workshop, which is the hard-to-sample population. So we don't have a good frame of the target population, or it might be a very rare population. There are also the cases of the hard to identify, and that might be because characteristics are sensitive, are stigmatizing or hidden. So for instance, even if we go and we sample and we make a listing, but we are then not able to actually capture things around a disability status, we might still not be able to actually capture the population group that we're interested in. Then we have the hard to find populations. So these are the very mobile populations, the nomads. We don't really know where to find them. The homeless, also the displaced people, recent refugees, but also population groups such as the young, who might just move very often and are hard to trace because they might not be in the parental home when we try to find them. Then we have the hard to contact, where often it's about access issues. It could be that it's gated communities, really, where it's really hard to even get to our sampling unit, or that we are thinking about institutional households, like, I don't know, prisons or orphanages, where we have a very vulnerable group possibly, but not included that easily in the sample. And then the other two that he mentions are kind of hard to persuade. So we're actually able to sample them. We know where they are, but they're just not that forthcoming in participating in surveys. It's often linked to, for instance, income groups or age groups, or just geographical areas where it's harder to get people actually to respond. And then you also might have people that are hard to interview just because of language issues, or also ethical concerns. So in our work, we often face the issue of having to target children, and it's actually ethically quite difficult to get around about having not just interviewing a proxy, not interviewing the father or the mother, but actually interviewing the child. So all of these issues will imply biases and also costs in dealing with them in some way. And quite often they're not exclusive, so you might have several of those happening at the same time. So what has been tried in the social sciences are, depending on what your aim is overall, have been different types of solutions. One, if you have actually a frame but it's not up to date and it might not have detailed characteristics, then you might start with kind of a random root approach, where you have a random start and then sample every so-and-so nth household, for instance. And the other option is, of course, is to do kind of a screening or a listing prior to the enumeration. And examples, for instance, on the informal sector would be also kind of multi-phase service, where you have first contact around household, for instance, but then try to find out if there are actually people in that household who also have an informal business. This is kind of I think, what we are most used to and are quite good at. Then another possibility linked to that is the same thing, but then trying to identify stratas that are clustering more of those target populations that are difficult to find. So I had a previous project, for instance, where we tried to find migrants, and in Dakar, return migrants with a specific type of migration experience. So we first try to find geographical strata with high prevalence of individuals with migration experience and oversample those. But then even within that, we again try to list and identify those with specific migration experience, and again oversample those as well in the second step. So we had various stages of oversampling to, in the end, get to a sample that we could analyze. You also have kind of adaptive sampling approaches, where you don't have a kind of a priori understanding of your frame and your selection probability, but you select your sample depending on who you find in the first place. So in a clustering approach, for instance, you would once you find someone who has a certain characteristic, like, for instance, a certain ethnic group, you would then go on to the next cluster and also select that cluster, because there might be a higher chance that people who share similar characteristics also live in the same area. Then you have a second type of approach, which is around location and time-based sampling. So now we are getting into those populations which are really quite rare, where we don't have a frame, and which are also hard to identify and hard to contact. So on the time location sample, it's again my examples from the migration research are around visiting, for instance, centers where migrants come together, or for instance churches, and sample from the centers, and you have to actually come up with a list of all the places where they possibly could come together, and then also ask the respondents about all the places they visit, to then afterwards constitute what is my probability of actually selecting that particular respondent in that church. So we had done this with undocumented Senegalese migrants in Italy, for instance, or also Congolese migrants in Belgium. Then slightly similar is a capture-recapture sampling method, where we again go to a certain location and then come back at a later stage and try to see how many of those that we found in the first place do we also find in the second round of interviewing. And that's better suited to actually calculating the overall population size rather than drawing a sample. So in our world, this might be used for looking at street children who always congregate at certain roundabouts, or nomads going to certain water points to water their cattle. So it still needs a lot of information, because it needs a complete list of all the locations people go to. And you might still have big issues with bias if actually some of the subgroups don't go to those. Yeah, so if you actually still exclude certain groups that are particularly interesting and vulnerable from your sample. And the third type is a kind of network-based, where a non-probabilistic approach is snowballing, where you just ask respondents about other types of of persons with similar characteristics, and you have this chain referral. But in that case, it's almost impossible to get any idea of a selection probability. And then some people try to improve on that by developing something that's called respondent-driven sampling, where you still do the same thing, but you actually capture also the number of possible contexts that they have and they could refer you to. And then on that basis, you try to calculate your selection probabilities a posteriori based on how many you actually sampled from all the network members that were reported. And that was, the early examples were more around the risk of contracting HIV, which is again a population that was hard to reach. And people thought, okay, through the networks, we have a better way of getting at them. And then from my own experience, again, we used something like that in the migrant network approach. So it needs a lot of assumptions around the network coverage, that actually we cover, everyone knows people who actually have the characteristics we want to capture in our data. And it might still be problematic for extremely sensitive characteristics where people actually don't want to report on and refer you on to another person. So this was just an overview of the different approaches that have been used in social sciences. But I think overall it's a field that is still evolving, and a lot of those more innovative methods, they still have lots of issues around undercoverage and biases. So I think it's helpful for us to try out further and learn from other disciplines as well. But this was just a flavor of what has been happening. So I'll hand over to Fred.
So I don't have lots of slides, but I do have some pictures which I can revolve in the background so that you can get a sense of what the place where this project took place and why it was a bit difficult. I wouldn't pay too much attention to the title either, because I just came up with that quickly on the train as I was coming, and not sure how appropriate it is. But this was in the context of, we were commissioned to do an evaluation of a cash transfer in Kenya, and in particular in northern Kenya. It was an unconditional cash transfer called the Hunger Safety Net Programme, as Matthew mentioned. It was run by the government and supported by DFID. And it was in this particular region of the country, which has some peculiar characteristics, which I'll come to. I mean, but it also, there were various activities that we were kind of committed to undertake as part of the evaluation. We were doing a impact evaluation using experimental design, a randomized controlled design. We were doing kind of operational monitoring to assess the performance of the program delivery. And we had a couple of other studies on the side, in particular an assessment of program targeting. So this was a program that was trying to reach a very poor population and had a kind of targeting, or several pilot targeting mechanisms to do that. And we wanted to assess which was most effective at reaching the poor. And it was a mixed methods. We were using both qualitative and quantitative methods. And so we needed, from the quant side, a sample that could deliver to all of these objectives. And these are all things that we've done a lot of, even in Kenya, but not in this particular context. So hopefully these will cycle. That is a picture of the payment machine that the beneficiaries use to pick up their cash. We'll see if this picture changes. There you go. So you can pay attention to these. This will give you a sense of what this place is like. And the first thing to say is that these are very large counties, as they're now known, very sparsely populated and very arid. They are part of what's known in Kenya as the ASALs, the arid and semi-arid lands. They're large, they're sparsely populated, and they have very high rates of poverty. In one of them, Turkana, the poverty rate was in excess of 90%. They were all upwards of like 70, 66%. So very poor areas. And the predominant livelihood was pastoralism. So a significant portion of the population was quite mobile. And it also meant that these areas were marked by kind of insecurity and sporadic conflict, as occasionally the pastoralist communities come into conflict over grazing and water resources and so forth. So for the various purposes that we needed to deliver, we needed a sample of the whole population. And we did not have a frame for that. We did have a partial frame in that we had the list of program beneficiaries, but we also needed the non-beneficiaries. So that was our basic challenge. How would we build this frame to get the beneficiaries and the non-beneficiaries? And for reasons of cost and logistical feasibility, as well as this need to build a frame, we were using a clustered approach. And those counties are kind of subdivided into locations and sublocations. And a sublocation is a relatively small unit, area of land, and it's an administrative local government unit, so it has a chief. And that was the smallest unit at which the program operated. So we were able to utilize the sublocation as our cluster, and that was also our unit of randomization. As I say, at the beginning, there were these security concerns. Sometimes insecurity would break out in any one sublocation. And at the time when we drew the sample, in conversation with DFID, who were funding the evaluation, we had to exclude, kind of for a duty of care reasons and other reasons, some of these sublocations from the sample frame. And I think it was a bit problematic. In hindsight, like I don't think we should have done that because of the nature of the conflict. It could explode 1 minute there and then disappear, and by the time you get there to do data collection, it's all fine again. And where you have ended up selecting, that could be in conflict. So I think we probably were too conservative in excluding too many sublocations from our sample frame. But that's the benefit of hindsight. But nevertheless, we were able to pin down a sample frame of sublocations, select around 50 of those, and then we went into them. And then the problem was, okay, how will we locate the population and list the population? Now these are all, we did several what we called sampling missions, kind of pre-test missions to work out. I mean, it was quite an iterative process. We went quite to town on it because it was quite difficult. And we were really concerned with capturing these fully mobile pastoralists, as we called them. because we felt that they were likely the people to be excluded from the benefits of the programme. They had their own particular characteristics, and we really wanted to try hard to include them in the sample. So we'd sit with the kind of sublocation chiefs and a group of elders and knowledgeable community members to try and identify everyone in the sublocation. And we ended up with, I'll tell you where we ended up first and then how we got there, maybe that's the easiest way. So within any given sublocation, there'll be a collection of settlements. Some of them are kind of permanent settlements. There might be a kind of main settlement where the chief resides. And then there'll be some impermanent settlements that come and go, and they move. They move about, and they all have multiple names as well, just to really complicate the picture. So what we ended up doing was, we were doing the survey using CAPI, computer-based methods. And so we were able to go into every sublocation, produce a list of every settlement just by type, the main settlement, permanent settlements, impermanent. And then we had a sampling protocol based on the numbers of beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries we needed to capture, and we were able to sample the main one with certainty and then pick off one or two permanent and one or two impermanent. And that was where we ended. And in that way, we felt that this was our best effort to try and get these mobile populations, because the fully mobile population are in these impermanent ones. Like that. So, but getting there took quite some time, as I say. And the reason it did, because we'd turn up and we'd speak to the chief and we'd have a long conversation about who was in the sublocation. And there's also some very complex clan dynamics in these places and sub-clan dynamics. And there's a lot of tension potentially between these clans often, or sub-clans. And so obviously, who belongs in a sublocation is different from who's registered there, or who sort of officially belongs there is different from who actually is there at any one time. So you'd have a conversation with the chief and they'd say, yeah, there's this group, there's that village, there's this impermanent settlement. And you go, that's everyone. And they go, yeah, that's everyone. You're sure? And they go, yeah, you're sure. And then you'd go off and you'd find another group of people. And you'd come back and go, what about they? Go, oh yeah, they're sometimes there. And so we did a lot of exploring around this. And one method that we tried was we had these maps from the Kenya Bureau of Statistics. They weren't always very accurate, so sometimes we had to kind of redraw the maps of the sublocation with GPS. And we had the CAPI, and it was a bespoke tool, so we had some flexibility. And what we did was, one thing that we tried was we divided the map up into grid squares, and we identified settlements in the grid square, and we'd sample those, sampling grid squares, and then we'd sample what we called the bushy grid square. We would just sample one grid square where there was no settlement or impermanent settlement identified. And then we just sweep this grid square, just walk it. It may have been a kilometre square or something like that, and we'd walk up and down it. And you can see from some of these pictures, and it's pretty sparsely populated with trees and so on. So, and I remember, doing this, and we had on our machines a little grid, and you were, when the dot was green, you were in the grid square, and you knew when you got to the boundary because you could see the dot and it would go red. So I'd spent and it's very hot in these places. I think Turkana has the hottest average temperatures in the world. And we'd spent a long time, sweeping this bushy grid square. And I got to the end, and there was this household, a single household, just sat just about 6 meters outside of the grid square. And I managed to persuade the guy to just move his stool, just because I wanted to interview someone. So we had a long kind of iterative process of trying to capture these difficult people who might not show up. And eventually the most efficient and the best way was for us to identify these impermanent settlements and really have a detailed conversation and make sure that you really critiqued what the community was saying, because there could be these excluded clans or whatever. And then once you had that, then you could sample, and then you could go and do a listing. Once you'd identified this place, you could go and list all the households, and then during that you could identify beneficiary status, and then we could sample from a group of beneficiaries and a group of non-beneficiaries. So, I mean, that was our approach, and I think with hindsight, certainly I think we would have changed the way we approached the insecurity. I mean, there were cases where we'd excluded some places for insecurity. When we turned up to the places we'd selected, there was insecurity, and when there's insecurity, the population just leaves. And you can track them, so you can go, they'll be next door, you know, you just go and find them there. And so there were things that we would definitely do differently in trying to gather these. This was also a panel survey, so we were coming back. And in this method, I think overall, what's my numbers, we suffered about 10% attrition. And it was about 5,000 households we were chasing. So I think that was not too bad. I mean, it was within our kind of safety limits for the power calculations and everything. There are a lot of I mean, there was an issue with the weighting, and maybe it's something interesting to talk about. But just so that you know, like what we found, we had this disaggregation of the population into kind of households that were fully settled. Everyone was staying in one place all the time. Partially settled households, so some of the household members, the mother and the grandmother and the children were in a place, and then the young boys and the men were off with the animals, following the animals, and then fully mobile, the whole household. And what we ended up finding was that around 73% of the population was fully settled, 17% was partially settled, and 10% was fully mobile. My guess is that's slight underestimation of the fully mobile and partially mobile population group, but that was what we found, our best guess after all this experimentation. Anyway, that's it.
Okay, what I'm going to talk about is private schools and measuring private schools, because we think of a school as a fixed institution often. And we want to measure things about these institutions for the sustainable development goals, which Cora was talking about before. So these are the sort of things that we want to measure. And you'll notice that some of these, they're not just characteristics of pupils. You actually need to know something about the institution as well. If you're going to find out whether somebody is being educated, whether the education they're given is suitable for educating them in sustainable development or global citizenship, or whether they are developmentally on track. You can't just find that by talking to the child. You also need to have an idea of the experiences which they've been through. This is, you heard earlier about the tier 3 indicators, which are supposed to be the ones which are the hardest to measure at the moment. So things like, are you developmentally on track in health, learning, and psychosexual well-being? Has global citizenship education for sustainable development been mainstreamed in the curricula and in student assessment? Is the education which people are receiving, is the proficiency which they've received, is it satisfactory in some sense? So a lot of these things, they're things which you can't just capture a child and assume that yes, capture them. And this is traditionally the way that these sort of things have been done is by you going to schools. They're measurements which take place in schools, and the assumption has always been that really when you're talking about the school system, you're talking about the school system, the schools of the poor, the schools which are relevant for development. You're talking about public schools. But that assumption is less and less sustainable, because over the past few years there's been there've been two things which have been happening. One is the enrollment rates have finally been going up, so you get more and more and more children in school, but at the same time you've had a movement, the proportion in private schools has gone up massively, and in some places, and Lagos is one of them, it's now overtaken the public schools, and most children in Lagos, most children in a lot of the big cities in India and Pakistan are now going to private schools. And in theory, these private schools, there's always a sort of a registration process. In theory, all these schools should be marked down somewhere, so you should be able to just in the same way as you can get a list of public schools and then take some sort of sample from the list and then go and visit the schools and find out things about them, you should be able to get a list of private schools as well. Because all these private schools, there's always a law, there's always some sort of control of state control of education at some level, and they should all have registered in some way. And this is the registration process they're supposed to go through in Nigeria. And you'll see it has 6 stages, and in theory, the first thing, the schools are supposed to register before they start operating. First, they're supposed to at least do the name search. When they come up with the name of their school, they're supposed to go and see whether somebody else has the same name in the same place. Then they're supposed to go through all these 6 stages, which check whether they've got all the right characteristics which a good, proper school should have. And then if they have them all, they're registered, and then they're a registered school. But in practice, many schools actually start first and then think about registering afterwards, because registering has a cost, and why would you want to do it unless you actually knew that you could set up and start a school? And then many actually stop after they've registered their name, and just because they find that a lot of the registration, a lot of the requirements are very onerous, and they can't meet them. They don't get inspected, and so these registration systems don't work in practice in the way that they ought to. And when they are registered, there are actually lots of different people who ought to register a school. So there is the school registers themselves. They're supposed to. There are the education management information systems, which are in theory, they're in every state, and they are supposed to, every state in Nigeria, they are supposed to have lists of schools as well. And these lists are, that's supposed to cover, in theory, legally, it's supposed to cover private schools as well as public schools. There's different tiers. There's the state education ministries have lists. The State Universal Basic Education Commission, which are called SUBECs, they have lists. The people whose job it is to actually inspect the school, school inspectors have lists. There are financial records, so the financial lists. The Teachers Association has lists. Exam boards have lists of pupils, and there are lots of lists which schools should be on, and of course they're not the same. They don't. So this to give you an idea. These are schools who have registered their names, and you'll get an idea of the sort of how close and how hard to distinguish the names can be. So the name checking process doesn't work very well. The addressing process doesn't work very well. These are actually quite good addresses, but the street names are not really. Often street names are not used in many places, so that the description and the location are not recognized by anybody. And there are many different things which are all called schools. So this is a school, and this is in fact Queen's School in Lagos. This is a school in Lagos. This is also a school in Lagos. And so is this. And so is this. And even so is this. This is a school in Lagos as well. This is a floating school on the lagoon. And so there's an enormous range of different things which are all called schools, and which may or may not be on these different registers. And you could say, well, look, we'll adopt a household approach to this. We'll try and get at these children through the household, and then we'll get at the schools through the children. And so there are these sort of children who you can't get at very easily through a household survey. These children are not going to fall into a household survey. They might possibly be going to some sort of an institution of some sort, but they're not going to show up in a household survey. And even when you do go through the household survey, there are lots of the things you would want to know about the schools, which the parents don't know. They are not good judges often. They don't the quality of the schools. They can't tell you, for instance, whether the school is following the national curriculum or not, and because that lists you've seen it earlier as far as UNESCO is concerned. If they're not following a recognised curriculum, then they're not actually in the school, so they don't actually, that doesn't count as a school. And when they do know the name of the school, whatever name they know, it's not going to be the one which is on the school list. And so you have this problem. You can do a household survey. You can get an idea of you can get these lists of schools which these children in these households actually go to. You can maybe find something about the children, but then how do you then relate that to your administrative lists? So this is just a thing where we for the schools which we could link in this particular Nigerian household survey. This is a comparison of parental participation, parental perceptions of teacher quality and school records on teacher qualifications. And you can see there is not very much relationship at all between these things. So I'm just trying to make the point that you can't. It's quite difficult to actually. You can't say, okay, we can't find these institutions, so we're going to go at everything through the households. So we have to yes, you have to come up with these. You have to somehow try and capture these schools. And the methods that we adopted that were adopted for this school census in Lagos, it was an area-based method. So let's go area by area, select, and first you'd say, okay, we're going to go for structures like you would in a census, and because firstly you're expecting that a school will be a structure. Of course, many schools are not structures, or you have the same structure and it's a school in the morning and something else in the evening. Then our next sort of resort was something we called child chasing, where you observe children in the street because there'll only be certain times of day at which they're going back and forth to schools, and then. Yes, they almost always wear a uniform. Even though in a very informal school, they will wear some sort of recognisable common clothes, and then you can follow them or to try and find out where they're going to school and build up a list of schools that way. And these techniques, they will give you a list which you can then use for frames, and you can sample, and you can use this list for your. But what happens is, at least in Lagos at this time, you develop this list. There was in 2010, there was a private school census, which was developed through these sorts of methods. But then when we went back in, I think it was 2014, was it? And tried to draw a frame from this census, and then for a sample survey, you find out that a lot of the schools aren't there anymore. So lots of them have closed. So the schools aren't there anymore. They have, and there are new schools have grown up, or at least new schools are there. Sometimes there are new schools there who said they were there in 2010 and presumably were missed. So it's a dynamic population as well. And then you have this whole range. So some of it's from big, substantial, fixed schools right down to things where with just one head teacher alone. And there are a lot of these things with just one head teacher alone where you're thinking, is this a school or is it really a tutoring business? And it's not it's a continuum. So that's the problem of private schools. Yeah, and you cannot find them. Thanks.
So in ecology, we're often driven by conservation and management policies, and typically for those we need some kind of idea of how many animals are left, so particularly for the endangered kind of species. So I'm principally going to talk about abundance estimation, which I guess is a bit different to what's come so far. Sort of talk through how capture-recapture methods have been developed and sort of where we're up to currently. And then I'll also talk about some ongoing work on some sort of multiple source or multiple list style data. So as I say, talk through some of the models. I have a couple of examples. So for the capture-recapture, great crested newts is my go-to data set. And for the multiple list data, moving away from ecology more to the epidemiology side of things, I've got some data on injecting drug users in Glasgow. So the idea behind capture-recapture, just for those who've perhaps not met it before, is that we go out to the population that we're interested in counting several times, and we just try to catch animals from that population. When we catch those animals for the first time, we have to mark them in some way such that we can identify them if we capture them again. Now that varies a lot by species, so some have quite natural or have natural markings that are unique to them. So great crested newts, their belly spot pattern is unique, so we don't have to do anything physical to them. Seals typically get flipper tags. Birds get ringed, sheep have ear tags. Some animals get branded. They used to chop toes off frogs, things like that. So we're moving towards more of the tagging or photo identification where possible. So what happens is if we know the individuals and we can identify them, then when we catch them, we know whether they are new individuals or whether we've seen them before. So it's a recapture. So we store these histories in something called a capture history, and it's simply a 0 usually denotes that that animal wasn't seen at that time when we went to catch them, and a 1 is that they were seen. So I work in discrete time. So you can think of a capture might be within a week. So they might be out catching animals for a week, but we discretize the data, so it's just did we see the animal that week or not. So here's some example capture histories. So just strings of 1s and 0s. Now there's going to be individuals in the population that we don't see at any point, so they'll correspond to capture histories that are completely 0s. So those are the ones that we're interested in trying to work out how many we've missed. So the basic assumptions, and these are the very baseline assumptions of capture-recapture. First of all, we have to assume it's a random sample from the population. We have to say that capture and marking does not affect survival. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So I think it was penguins, they discovered that tagging them affects their survival rates. We can't misidentify individuals, and marks cannot be lost, so we have to be able to keep track of an individual once we've seen them. All individuals have an equal probability of capture, and finally that survival is independent of age, and it's also equal for all individuals. So I think you can agree they're rather unrealistic assumptions to place on any population, so methods very quickly were developed to start letting us relax these assumptions. So I'll try and keep notation to a minimum, but just to save me writing. So K is the number of capture occasions that they've gone out to try and see these animals. N is the total population size, so that's what we're really after, that's what we're trying to estimate. If little n is then the number of animals we did see, then the difference between those two is the number that we've missed. P is capture probabilities, so they're usually also of interest for the species. Likewise, survival, so it's apparent survival because we don't know if an animal's either died or just left the area that we're actually sampling from, but I'll just call it survival probabilities. Further thing to mention, populations tend to be divided into two categories. We have open populations, so these can have births, deaths, migrations, so the animals are coming and going from the population that we're sampling from. The opposite to that is a closed population, so this is when it remains constant across all of your capture occasions. So there's no births, there's no deaths, there's no migration. You're sampling the same group of animals each time. So I'm going to stick with open populations tonight. There's sort of a separate sideline for closed populations. So the first sort of models that came along with the Cormack-Joly-Sieber models. So they were initially developed to estimate survival. So abundance wasn't their main purpose. And what it does is it conditions on the first capture of each individual, and in doing so, it actually makes abundance estimation impossible to get directly, and by directly I mean through the likelihood. So we don't estimate it as a parameter. We have to do some work afterwards. So these models, again, they start to relax some of the assumptions. So they now say that the capture and the survival probabilities are time dependent. So they're different for each occasion that we've gone out to catch the animals. So I'll subscript P and phi with a K, just to note that. And just worth noting that I use phi K to mean that you're alive at K and you survive until K plus 1. So run through some example histories. So 110011 is what we observed. So using the parameters now, we can start to write down probability statements. So we condition first that we saw the animal at time 1. We know looking through their history that they've survived, so phi 1. Time 2, we caught them, so P2, and again we know that they've survived because there's 1s later in their history. We then missed them on occasion 3, so we have 1 minus P3, phi 3, 1 minus P4 again because we missed them, phi 4. We capture them, they survive, and then we capture them, and then that's the end of the study, so we don't know what comes after that. But suppose we now have a history that has some zeros before the first capture and after the final capture. Well, we're conditioning on first capture, so we don't have to worry about those leading zeros. We know that there's another 1 in the history, so they must have survived after occasion 3. Now, what happens on occasion 4? Well, we caught them, that's fine, but afterwards there's just zeros, so we don't know what's happened to this animal. So we have some options starting to come in. So they either died or left the area, so that's a 1 minus phi 4, or they've survived, in which case they're around in time 5. We've missed them, at which point they might have died, or they've survived, and then we've missed them at time 6. So we have to start considering options for what might have happened to the animal. So taking those individual histories, we can write out these probabilities. So to build the likelihood, we just product over all the individuals that we have seen. So I just group together the phi's, and then you either see or you don't see them at each time point. And then just for some, to make the likelihood look a little simpler, those options of whether you've survived and died or survived and missed, etc., they're just combined in that chi-li term. So that can be generated recursively. So we know at the final occasion that the probability you're not seen again is 1 because we've not been back to look. But we can work backwards to get to our terms for chi-k at any point. So how do we go about getting abundance then if it's not been estimated as part of the likelihood? Well, one way that you can get around it is through the Horvitz-Thompson-like estimators. So essentially, we know how many animals we saw, and we've got an estimate of the probability that we saw the animals. So we can use those 2 pieces of information to get out the number of animals that were there in total. So if we think about the unmarked individuals that we were capturing each time, so we've caught them, but it was the first time that we'd seen them, so they were unmarked. And we have an estimate 4p from the model. Then we now have an estimate for the total number of unmarked individuals that were in the population at time k. So halfway there, if we want total abundance, then we don't just need the unmarked animals, we also need to know how many marked animals there were in the population. Now those aren't just going to be the ones that we catch at any one time. There will be some marked individuals in the population that we miss every time. So we just need to take into account, and then there's the fact that they're surviving or not between the occasions as well. So we just combine this information to give us estimates for the number of unmarked and marked at each occasion, combine them, and you've got an estimate for n. Now ideally, so the Cormack-Jolly-Sieber model actually runs into some issues. I didn't mention it here, but you can also estimate the number of births at each time, but it runs into some issues because you're not modelling those as part of the process, generating them. You can actually get negative birth estimates. So the way around this is to somehow put the total abundance estimate into the model. So we want to remove that conditioning on the first capture. and estimate abundance directly through the likelihood. So this was first developed by Schwartz and Arneson. So they brought in the idea of a superpopulation, and then the stopover models continued on with those ideas. So the superpopulation actually means something in Bayesian statistics. So I've moved away from using that terminology and instead just call it the total population. So that's all individuals that visit the site during your sampling period on at least one occasion, and they may or may not have been captured. So that is all of the individuals that you do see, as well as those that we're missing. How do we remove the conditioning? Well, we just explicitly model the arrivals in arriving into the population available for capture. Now, arrivals could have several definitions, and it varies by population. So it could be births. It could be recruitment to, say, the breeding population. It could be arrival at a colony. So that's where the name stopover models came from. They were first developed to try and estimate the stopover duration of migratory species at a certain site. Age doesn't necessarily mean physical age in the stopover model. It means the time since you arrived in the population. So if you arrived 2 occasions ago, you are age 2, for example. So again, relaxing the assumptions a bit further, capture and survival probabilities are now time and time since arrival dependent. So we need some extra notation. Beta are now going to be our arrival probabilities, so that's in addition to what we've already got notation-wise. And then we just add some extra subscripts to the P and Phi's to show that they now have 2 possible dependencies. So again, some example capture histories. So we've seen this one before, but now we're not conditioning. We knew the animal must have arrived in the gap or immediately prior to the first occasion. So occasion 1 is the first time that we could possibly have caught them. We did in fact capture them, but there's now 2 subscripts on P. So P11, they're age 1 because they've just arrived, and Phi11. We capture them, and looking forward again, there are further 1s in the history, so we know that the animal survives. We miss them, but we know it survives. On occasion 4, we again miss them, but we know it survives. We then capture them, we know it survives, and finally we capture them. So what happens to the leading zeros this time? Well, it's similar to the summation we saw for what happens if you have trailing zeros at the end. They might have arrived to be captured on occasion 1, but we've missed them. They must have survived because there's 1s later on. Alternatively, they've arrived just prior or for the first time on occasion 2, and we've missed them. We know that they're surviving at this point, or they've arrived for occasion 3. And then we have a capture, survival, and because we have lots of 1s, the probabilities are pretty straightforward. So we now have 2 summations. If there had been trailing zeros on the end again, we would have had to consider all combinations of arrival times along with all the possible times that you could have died and left the population. So we don't typically use that chi summation. That chi term is recursive definition. We just sum. So we end up with double summations. The likelihood is multinomial in nature, so we divide. What happens is we group the animals by their capture history, and then you have those that we've seen, so they have a type of capture history, and then there's those that are missed. We product over the animals we do see, again allowing for any or all possible birth times, all possible death times, survival, and then capture or missing them in between all of those times. But now that we have this capital N, we have to consider the ones that we've also missed. Now they all have the same history, it's just all zeros. So they could have arrived at any occasion, 1 to K, and they could have died on any occasion from B to K. So the summation is exactly the same, it's just the indices we sum over is a bit different. We have a likelihood, and that likelihood now contains the total population, so we can simply maximize and get estimates directly. So what came next? Well, many capture-recapture studies, they go out and sample the population, typically annually. Breeding season is really popular. But they go back year after year, and they do this sampling again and again. And many of the common methods analyse each year of data just separately, just on its own. They only consider that period of data. So we wondered, is that not cutting things out? Why aren't we analysing everything collectively? Surely there's information to be had in the trends over the years within the population. So to do this, we think of the data in two levels. We have primary occasions, so that's the large overarching one, so we consider that as, for example, the year. But within those primary periods, you have lots of secondary capture occasions, so those might be the weekly events that you're going out capturing. Typically, the secondary occasions are much closer in time, and your primary occasions are the ones that are much further apart, so there's a space between your sets of secondary occasions. Now, the robust design models can do this. They come in two forms. There's closed and open. The closed robust design assumes that movement is open between the primaries, so between the years animals can come and go, but when you're conducting your secondary sampling, so for example the breeding season, it assumes the population's closed. So they must have all arrived at the same time, and then they've all stayed while you're happily sampling them, and then they've all left at the end. There's been no movement to and from as you go along. How do we get abundance estimation? Well, because you're using closed population models within each primary, you can get abundance directly through the models. However, closure seems a bit, again, unrealistic for most species. So the open robust design model tried to address that. Again, open between the primary, but this time it's also open movement during the secondary occasions, so you can have animals coming and going. However, they go back to sort of the CJS approach, and they condition on the number of animals that you see within each primary. So again, they remove this option of getting abundance directly, and you have to go and resort to other methods again, like the Horvitz-Thompson style estimators. So this led to the proposal for my PhD work, which was to try and come up with a model that removed that conditioning again and put abundance back into the likelihood expression. So additional notation now, everything stays the same in the secondary level of the model, but we now have this primary set of occasions. So let T be the number of primary occasions. R I call the recruitment probabilities. And now S, I call the survival, so that's now on the primary level. So we're tracking whether you're alive each year. So phi, I call retention probabilities now. So it's, are you staying at the site or not, or have you left? Survival can be time and age, and again, age is time since recruitment in the primary level. Within the secondary, we have arrivals, captures, and retentions. And they can now also depend on primary occasions. So we've got each capture occasion, we have age since you've arrived within that year, and then also that year can have a dependence. So again, greater flexibility being built in. So the data we get is essentially just the secondary capture histories. But from those, we can recover the primary level information of simply did or didn't we see you that year. So for this individual, they must have been recruited into the population in that first year because we've seen them. We then simply have the probability that we see that set of capture histories. Well, that is just the single year stopover model that's already in existence. We know that they survive, again, because there are further ones in their primary history. We have probability this time of a 0 history in the second year. Again, they survived, and then we have another capture history. Now, the same happens. What happens if we have leading and trailing zeros in that primary level of the history? Well, you just end up summing over the options. So they might have arrived at time 1. They might have arrived at time 2 and then died, or they were the individuals that arrived at time 1, survived, and then died. And then those that are dead have left, but if you're still alive, you either immediately died, and so on and so on. So we just end up with more and more of these summations. Now, the likelihood doesn't fit on one slide, so I'm not going to show it. So how do we actually go about fitting them? So, first of all, so N this time is still the total abundance, but because we now have this much longer time that we're considering, N is all of the animals that may or may not have been captured but were available at least once during all of our years of study. You can get at the yearly estimates of N if that's what you're interested in, using, once we've fit the model, using your estimates for recruitment and survival. You can estimate N per year. Now, what's the strength in combining all of this information? Well, we can actually share parameters across the year. So they don't have to be dependent on primary occasion. We can share them instead. So this is particularly useful if we have really small populations, so we can pool information from across the years. Parameter redundancy is probably an issue in these models. If you're trying to fit all of these dependencies and you're fitting individual parameters for each, you will run into problems, but that's not been fully explored as to what you can and can't fit yet. So how do we go about fitting them? So as I say, the likelihood is rather long and complicated, and it's not quick to optimize if you program it in that way. So instead, we resort to defining the model as a hidden Markov model. And then that is just, you follow on with likelihood maximization. So a hidden Markov model has sort of two levels to it. First of all, there is a hidden process going on. So this is the state that an animal is in. And to define the integrated or the multi-period stopover model in that form, the hidden state is their availability for capture. So they're not yet available, they are available, and then at some point they become not available. That's the progression of the states. Given the state that you're in, there is then an observation process applied. So conditional on the state, you are seen or not. So if you're not available yet for capture or you've died, then we know with certainty we can't capture you. Whereas when you're in the middle state of being available, you may or may not be seen. So all of the parameters disappear into matrices. So the recruitment, survival, arrival, and retention probabilities are all describing the movement of you between the hidden states. And then the capture probabilities are just the observations. Do we see you or not? So that, in effect, we just rewrite the likelihood in terms of matrices. Matrices are far more efficient computationally, so the likelihood is then much quicker to evaluate and optimize. And it also opens up the opportunity to use things like the bootstrap to get the confidence intervals, because you're not waiting too long for it to fit. So what led us to come up with these integrated or multi-period stopover models? Well, it was the data on the great crested newts at the University of Kent. So this is Clint, the great crested newt. They're a protected species across Europe. They're bad news if you start building and find them, because you have to move them all on from the site before you can continue doing anything. So understanding their behavior is quite important. So as I say, this comes from it's a study site on the University of Kent campus. So they buried some ponds many, many years ago. They're now full of vegetation, and newts come every summer during their breeding season to breed in these ponds. So they've collected data since 2002. I've got currently about 12 years worth of that data, so up to 2013. Over those 12 years, there are 253 capture occasions, so about 20-something weeks each year they're out capturing these newts. As I say, newts are identified by their spot pattern. So they use bottle traps to catch them, and then they use a plastic tub with a piece of foam with a newt shape cut out of it. You can quite happily place a newt in there and take a picture quickly, and then they have a folder of all the newts. So there's 106 individuals seen over those 12 years, so it is not a huge population. And they identify them by hand at the minute. There isn't anything automated going on. Yeah, you can look them up in their folder. Now, in 2009, they actually decided to increase the number of ponds at the site. So there were originally 4. They increased that to 8. So the newts could first colonize them in 2010. So they were specifically interested in whether there would be any differences between those old and new ponds, because the old are really well embedded in, they're full of vegetation, the bottle traps are exceptionally well hidden, there's lots of food in them, whereas the new ponds were rather sparse looking when they first put them in. And they wanted to know how sort of quickly would those differences disappear between the two. So we first analysed the data using the multi-period stopover model. We used forward selection to determine what the parameters should be depending on, whether they should be shared across the years or not. Now, it wasn't developed at the time, but to distinguish between the old and the new ponds, we had to come up with a multi-state form of the stopover model. So in addition to all the dependencies we already had available to us, the capture probabilities could now also depend on the type of pond you were in, so old or new. Thankfully, the HMM framework came in rather useful for this. So you just add in an extra state. So they're available, and they're either available in old ponds or they're available in new ponds, and they can move freely between them. So they're quite closely spaced. So the HMM form came in really useful there. So these are the type of results we were getting back. So we were estimating recruitment just as a separate parameter for each year. They obviously have to sum to 1. An animal must be recruited at some point. Because of the sheer number of occasions we were working with, so there was 250 over the 12 years, we decided to put a logistic regression on the arrival and retention within each year. For the arrivals, the intercept term ended up being shared across the years, so that didn't change, but the gradient was allowed to vary by year. Whereas it was the opposite for the retentions. It ended up being that the gradient was actually the same each year, and it was the intercept. So effectively the time that they were leaving was moving, was wandering slightly. Now we suspect that that actually might be better captured by some environmental covariate information. So we need to work out how to incorporate those into the model. As for the capture probabilities, so the multi-state was only over the final 4 years, so it was just a single state model up to that point. We essentially didn't find many differences in the capture probabilities, at least. There's certainly a lot of overlap in the confidence intervals, so the ecologists were a little surprised by that. They thought that the vegetation and how well the traps were hidden might have an effect, but the newts really don't seem to mind about being trapped. So the traps get put in late on an evening and collected first thing in the morning. So they're not in them very long. They obviously don't get stressed out or anything. As for the state-dependent parameters, so now that once we had the two states, we had to model movement between them, so movement between the old and the new ponds. But we also had to introduce a parameter that says when you arrive at the site, what kind of pond do you go into? So probability of picking an old pond on arrival, this did seem to change over time. So in the first year that those new ponds were available, they definitely preferred the old ones as their initial choice when they arrived at the site. And that might just be because they know where they are. They hadn't yet found the new ones. And that difference essentially disappeared within 12 months. Probabilities that you move between the different types of ponds were pretty low. So once a newt has picked its type of pond, it seems to stay loyal to that kind of pond. So if you like the old style, you stay in the old ponds. If you like the new ones, you tended to stay in the new ones. What was surprising, and we went back to check this, was the abundance estimate over those 12 years came out at 107. Now we saw 106. So we went back to them and we said, does this actually seem right? And they said, well, yes, actually. One of the years they did a drift fence survey. So they were trying to work out, indeed, how many do they actually see in any one year? And even though the capture probabilities aren't that high for individual occasions, etc., over the course of the 20 or so weeks that they were sampling, the probability that you were captured was quite high. So it does seem to be an odd case where it is almost a census, a complete census of the population. Not what we expected, but there we go. And finally, survival for this species seems to be constant across the years. So this is sort of the development and how they all link together. So I've mentioned CJS. That ties in with Schwarz-Arneson, etc. They move over to the robust design if you start using multiple years, and then all the stopover models come as a next development beyond that. So that's a really basic look at capture-recapture. Now, capture-recapture is not the only style of data. Sometimes we have recovery information as well. So as well as capturing live animals, you sometimes recover the dead ones. So that can get you around the unknown lifespan after if you end up with trailing zeros. So if you recover them dead, you know their outcome. Likewise, for birds, what tends to happen is they are ringed, released, and then you only get the recovery information. So there are models where you don't have the recapture bit in the middle. What I would like to do next, or what can be used, is the probabilities. So there are multi-state models available, so you're grouping or classifying the animals in some way, but to build in more individual heterogeneity so that their probabilities can genuinely differ by animal, and that could be in probability or in capture or survival. One way you can get through that is covariates. So introducing environmental covariates might be useful for the newts. If you're going to use individual covariates, so a sheep, their weight is a good indicator of survival. Problem is, capture-recapture, if you don't see the animal, then you don't know its weight. So how can you then get at its survival? So you have the associated missing data issues if you go down the individual covariate route. Spatial capture-recapture, so same process, but you now have location information. So if you think camera traps or microphone arrays, you know which ones have seen the animal and at what time. So they have to now include location information, and that means the additional modelling of animal movements. So you have to know how it possibly could have been caught on the pattern of cameras that it was. Continuous time capture-recapture. So I work at discrete time, but continuous time models also exist. Then there's the other assumptions in there. So suppose you are working with state type information, but are you definitely certain of its state at every time you capture it, or is there some uncertainty in there? Then you've got the closed population models on the other side, and then finally you can go down the route of integrated methods, so where you maybe have a combination of capture-recapture information, but then just counts. So I think that's popular with bats. So they can do net or drift counts on the bats, but then they might put some effort into a capture-recapture time. So how do you go about combining the information from all of those sources? So there are methods that deal with that too. So the other kind of data we're going to take a look at, it is capture-recapture in the sense that we are seeing individuals multiple times, but this time we don't track them through time in the way that we do with capture-recapture that I've just discussed. You're instead seeing them through several sources. So this is more common for the epidemiological type data. So humans, essentially, we see them in lots of different places. How can we combine that information? So what multiple list or multiple source methods do is they take the number of individuals seen by different combinations of the sources to try and estimate the number that have been missed by all of our sources. Again, some basic assumptions. Individuals are not misidentified, so there are methods for dealing with that one, but I'm not too familiar on them, unfortunately. We initially assume the sources are independent, and again, capture probability is equal for all individuals, so they all behave in the same way. So if we think about a three-source data set, sources A, B, and C, 0, 1 means that you were seen by that source or not. Well, we can then combine all of that information into a contingency table. So you fall into one of the cells of this table depending on which combination of sources saw you. And what we want to get at is the final cell, that N000, so where everyone missed you. Now, there are a few restrictions that we know. So we know that the total population must be the sum of those cell counts. And likewise, we know that the probability that you fall into each cell, they're disjoint. You can only belong to one if you've not been misidentified. So our probabilities must sum to 1. So what we simply have is a multinomial style model. So our cell counts are multinomial based on the total population and our cell probabilities. But if we have a distribution, then it's really easy to write down a likelihood. So where does the problem arise? Well, we want to estimate the number of people that were missed by all the sources, along with 7 probabilities, because if we know 7, we know the 8th. But that is 8 parameters, and we only have 7 data points. That's the other 7 ends. So there are redundancy issues. We simply can't fit that kind of model. So what seems to be the common approach is the log linear models. So we let P star be exponential, and then we define main effects for each of the sources. So we have a probability that you're seen by, or it relates to a probability that you're seen by source A, a probability you're seen by source C, B, or C. So we no longer have all 8 probabilities to worry about. We just have the 3. And then we just normalize our P stars such that they meet the condition that they sum to 1. We can immediately then relax the idea of independence between the sources by simply including interaction terms within that log linear model. So we can now have 2-way interactions. We can't have a 3-way interaction because of this same problem we had initially. So we have 6 parameters there, plus the n missed by all of them. There's our 7 parameters. We have 7 data points or pieces of information. So we can't do a 3-way interaction. Not if you're going to stick to the idea that you must have all lower level interactions to include the higher ones. For identifiability reasons, so that you only have or can find a single value of theta, certain restraints are placed on them, and again the common ones is that the main effects sum to 0, and likewise the interactions have sums to 0. So, data set on the number of females who reported injecting drug use over a 2-year period. It is specific to Glasgow, the data that I have currently. There are 4 sources for these data. The first is the database of hepatitis C diagnoses. We then have social inquiry reports. We have GP reports to the drug misuse database, and then there is also a second reporting system to the drug misuse database. So you can see sort of immediately why there would be overlap between some of these sources, but again, why some people might only be seen on 1 or 2 out of the 4. So the data, again, contingency table format, rather low numbers in a lot of these cells with a couple of fairly standout exceptions. These are very preliminary results. So the estimate of that missing cell comes back at over 4,000. So we're apparently missing pretty much all of them. Confidence interval's pretty wide on that, which is what makes me suspect that something isn't being modelled correctly at the minute, just using the log linear models. We can see why we're getting such a big estimate for the number of missed people. All of the main effects are negative, so essentially the probability that you're seen by any of the sources is incredibly small. There is a slight increase in your probability of being coarse if you're seen by B and D. So that was the social inquiry and this new drug treatment contact being reported to the database. So that combination was the only one that came back. So it used a step up forward model selection procedure because we didn't want to end up with an overly complicated model. That perhaps needs to be looked into, whether it should be forward, backward, or the step sort of in between, so that we balance out complexity with well-fitting models. So what needs to be done, because I do suspect that something's not quite right here, we need to include some sort of heterogeneity. Not everyone in this population behaves in the same way, is what I suspect is the main problem. So a few ways we could do that. Random effects would be one. But then on what level do we consider them? Do we put that into the cell, so cell random effects, which is essentially over dispersion, so we're letting it vary more than would be allowed under a strictly multinomial model? Or do we go down the route of putting it on the individual? Now that seems ideal, saying that everyone has different capture probabilities. But what I suspect will happen with that is each individual essentially only counts 1 point. It's just the cell that they fall into. If we want to now start trying to get at an individual probability for every individual, I think we're going to need more information. So the way I'm thinking of going about this is sort of the extension to a beta binomial, go Dirichlet multinomial. But for the Dirichlet distribution, we need a variance estimate, and it'll be getting that extra variance estimate that I think will be the problem. So what I suspect we might need is that, yes, we have these sources, but do we not have these sources being repeated through time and seeing the same individuals through time repeatedly? So is that a possibility to maybe explore? And then would that pull in some of the work from capture, where you're now tracking survival, perhaps, as well as are we seeing them or not? Likewise, issues surrounding parameter estimation, how we get variances. Do we do this Bayesian or do we do it classically? These are all sorts of things that I'm hoping to explore in the very near future. So this is very much work in progress. And just for anyone interested, there was a few references for the capture. Thank you.
So you don't mention physical areas very much. I mean, what is the issue with that? I mean, if you're going to one site, I can see with the newts it was one site.
Yeah.
But if you're starting to talk about large physical areas into which you can get a lot of internal migration between them.
Yeah.
And the other big one is, of course, capture, recapture. This cannot be cheap, whatever you're proposing to do. So really, just those two questions.
So if you're physically doing the recapturing, then yes, it is quite cost intensive. You have to put the people out there in the field to be doing it. Perhaps one way around that is the camera trapping or the microphone arrays, depending on what you're trying to count. They can get placed and then they're left and they're recording. So that's perhaps an alternative to sending people into the field. As for the area, that's always going to be an issue. We have to identify a suitable region that we can sample successfully. So sheep on St Kilda, it's an island, so pretty isolated, and they do have pretty good access to most of the island. So you have to be realistic, I guess, in the area that you can cover. But if you subsample a smaller area and you have reason to believe that that can be migrated to a larger one, then you can just adapt your methods, just expand into the, as I say, sample from the smaller one and then just multiply it for the area, supposing that it is or behaves in a similar way.
Yeah, okay. So on the recapture, do you have some idea of how many times you have to recapture to influence on precision or so? So is there some kind of understanding of how the composition changes depending on if you, in any given period, you recapture 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, 7 times, and so on?
So I'm not aware of any simulation study that looks at that in isolation. What typically happens is we do look at circumstances where the capture probabilities are either low or high, so we check the extremes. Most populations fall quite nicely into the middle. It tends not to affect things too much. What happens is with smaller capture probabilities, other things just gain greater uncertainty. The more you're seeing animals, the more certain you can be. So you tend to just see it in the standard areas changing. But I'm not aware of any predefined how many you have to.
So around here, I think about the budget, of course, you try to find the optimal number.
You balance time.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking what the link might be between what Hannah was saying and what Matthew particularly was saying, and it seems to be the last part of your talk is very similar to what the situation Matthew was describing. And I suppose the way, although what you want to do is to have a good sample, but if you were able to establish that the missing, in other words, you've got your multiple lists, you've got your series of theories and ones, and if you fitted a model under assumptions of independence of the kind that Hannah was talking about, you might find that in Hannah's term, N00000, because you have a lot of lists, is extremely small, which would help you to be fairly confident that the union of all those lists, assuming that the schools were completely probably identified on each list, would enable you to say that that union would form a reasonable sampling frame. It seems to me that might be the way that those two approaches could be linked in some way.
And might also give us a size of the population. But then there is a trickier bit, which I was going to ask you about, which is that often you've got lots of different lists, and you do your best to match them, and you're pretty sure. There are some you're pretty sure that they match, some you think they match, some you're not so sure. And can you cope with, as well as a survival probability, a matching probability?
Yeah, so there's a paper, possibly this one. So they deal with the idea that you don't know with certainty which individual it is that you've caught at any one time. So you introduce extra parameters into the model to deal with that idea of, well, we think we're about 80% certain, for example, or 20, and it allows for that distinction. For the multi-list stuff, that seems to have been looked into quite extensively, is how you deal with people not being identified correctly across the list. So I think methods definitely do exist for including that. Whether you can have something that does everything all in once, that I've not seen. So this heterogeneity and misidentification.
Another question, right? I was thinking as I was listening to you, and you doing the survival thing with the ones and ones, not so much just the private school, which is new, but even the traditional public school data, where a lot of the times you've got these schools which, they're not getting all the schools, but they're adding up the figure and publishing it as the national estimate of children in schools, and that's every country does something like that. In some countries, they make a very crude estimate for undercounting, which will be something to do with the schools we had on our list, as opposed to the ones who've actually given returns, something like that. If you were to develop a method based on these sort of techniques for going from these imperfect administrative lists to making a proper population size estimate, could you have a standard method which could be applied in the field, or would you need a proper mathematician in every country every year to actually develop a new methodology? Or is that an unanswerable question?
I think general methods could be found.
Because it's a very general problem. There are lots and lots and lots of administrative lists where people are producing national estimates by adding up the list.
So that's always going to be a lower estimate, usually.
Well, that's definitely, yes.
Sometimes people stay on business, they shouldn't.
Yes, yeah, and that's
the other way
as
around.
well. Yeah.
I suppose you probably could come up with a toolbox. I mean, it's not going to be perfect, but something that's at least better than the crude estimates that exist already.
Or just assuming that actually the population is just what we've captured. Yes, which is not unknown.
I was interested in you say at one stage you captured all the leaks, and basically you've got the right answer because you knew the answer already.
I mean, you after the fact, you weren't back to ask them.
And I maybe missed something, but have you
before even running any of the new data, we ran big simulation studies to try and work out how identifiable these parameters are. And N can be estimated without bias, it appears, regardless of how close to a complete census we really are. So, as I say, the newts, they came back, we were surprised when we got that result, and we went back to them and said, you know, does this seem reasonable, or have we done something horrifically wrong somewhere?
If you've missed out, say, the year in which they took all the newts, as it were, would you?
We could try it, yeah, we could. So as I say, they only did the drift fence survey in 1 year, and they discovered that they'd missed about 1 or 2 individuals in that year. So chances are the overall estimate over 12 years does seem to tie with what they think. It seems quite a special little population. It's so well established and not well looked after, but well monitored.
Maybe I can have another question. I was just looking at the back of my mind. I was wondering, do you need huge sample sizes to do this at all?
No, so, well, as usual, it depends on different data sets, etc. So the newts are tiny, and you can analyse each year's worth of data.
But you were getting almost every newt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were looking at so you had most of the population. So your sample size was close to 100%. I'm thinking of, okay, if you're looking at, if you're trying to track something in a population of 50 million people, you might have a standard household survey for such a population might have 5,000. Yes, okay, Cora, 5,000 people. In order to apply these sort of techniques, do we then need 50,000 people, or?
So I'm about, I've got some data on great cormorants that I'm going to take a look at. So that population runs into the tens of thousands, and of course they don't sample anything like that. So it'd be interesting to see if it picks that up. But in simulation studies, we ran up to about 1,000 individuals.
Yeah.
And it all seems to handle it quite fine, and especially with it being in the HMMs, the matrices, the population size doesn't affect computation time too much, which is something else that we worry about constantly.
So
how long do these things actually take?
That's you would, in order to get 10,000 people, 10,000 population of 10,000, you would have to have a sample of 1,000. Is that?
That's the data set size roughly that I have, and they suspect it's in about the 10,000s. So it'd be interesting to see if it scales.
Has anybody ever done any simulations to see how many you need to get a population of